I think Justin might sort of elaborate on what's changed in his life since we last caught up with him. But for those who don't know, Justin is a freelance broadcaster, author, podcaster, and until very recently has been heavily involved with Premier Christian Radio and his podcast, Unbelievable, as well as the author of the book of the same name. And for those who haven't read it, it's a fantastic read, and Justin has brought a few copies which are available for people to buy if they'd like to at the end. But I think, Justin, you're going to talk to us this evening about the evidence for Jesus from a skeptic's perspective. Is that?
Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. So I'll pass over to Justin, but as always, thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much for inviting me back. I'm trying to think how many times I've come and presented. Probably 3 or 4 times at least over the last few years. So I'm running out of topics to talk about, but I am going to be talking, as Jeremy mentioned, about the evidence for Jesus, which is something that actually did get covered in my old book now, which there are a few copies of at the back. If anyone wants a signed one, you'd be very welcome before you leave. But I am in an interesting transition phase at the moment. As Jeremy mentioned, I had been working at Premier Christian Radio for 20 years. It's really where I started in radio and journalism, and just this last Easter marks my final day at Premier Christian Radio as I'm moving on into a sort of freelance capacity on new projects, some new podcasts, investing in some of my own platforms as well. A new book on the way as well, so perhaps I'll come back in the new year and talk to you about that as well. That's called The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God, and I'm excited about some of the projects that I'm going to be working on around that as well. But yes, it's an exciting time, so thanks for having me back and being able to sort of catch you up on that and talk about this subject tonight as well. One of the things you can go and listen to and download and watch right away, actually, a new project I'm working on at the moment, is called Re-Enchanting. It's a new podcast I'm co-hosting, and that's produced by a website called Seen and Unseen, which is part of a new initiative from the Church of England called the Centre for Cultural Witness, being led by Bishop Graham Tomlin. It's based at Lambeth Palace Library, and on this new podcast, Re-Enchanting, I and my co-host Belle interview all kinds of interesting people, both with and without faith, about the way that we can re-enchant a secular culture with the vision of Christianity. In fact, one of your own young men, Matthew Lee Smith, is quite integral to that. He's been helping with the videoing at Lambeth Palace Library. So if you go and watch any of the videos, you'll see some of Matt's handiwork there as well. But that's a little sort of brief catch up on my life recently. But I thought tonight I'd kind of go back to some of the basics of what I've often spoken of, written about, and hosted many debates on, which is at the center of it all. Is there evidence for this person called Jesus Christ? Why have we got Poirot on the screen, you may be wondering. Can anyone name the actual actor who has played Poirot? David Suchet, that's right. David Suchet, well-known actor of both stage and screen. I think for probably, I don't know how many years he portrayed Hercule Poirot, but it was certainly for decades, I think. And he's got an interesting story, though, because he is obviously most recognised for playing Poirot, but what many people don't know about him as an actor is he's actually a committed Christian. And even fewer probably know the story of his adult conversion. I once had the privilege of interviewing David Suchet, and he told me what happened while filming in the USA in 1986. He had a stray thought while he was soaking in a hotel bathtub, and it changed the course of his life forever, because he began to wonder if there really was an afterlife. And, well, they say eureka moments happen in bathtubs, don't they? And this was a bit of a eureka moment for David Suchet, because it led him to get hold of a Bible and start to investigate its claims. And although he'd grown up in a nominally religious household, none of it had really stuck. He'd been more into sort of the Beatles and the Eastern religions and that kind of thing growing up. But as far as Christianity was concerned, he wasn't even sure that Jesus necessarily existed. He wasn't sure if he was a strictly historical figure or not, but he did remember from his school lessons that the Apostle Paul had written some letters. So he actually started, as he looked into the Bible, with the book of Romans. And he told me that he decided to employ the same technique that he used to use when reading scripts for the Royal Shakespeare Company. Reading it not as scripture exactly, but as if it was the first draft that had ever been read, a letter written not just for those first readers, but for David Suchet personally. And this is how he described it. He says, "I suddenly found a way of existing, a way of thinking and behaving and caring and looking at the world in a completely different way. And by the end of that letter, Romans, I was very moved, very emotional. I believed I had found what I had been looking for. Forget the gurus, forget everything else. I'd found a new way of being in the way Paul describes the Christian life." So that encounter in Romans sent David Suchet back to the Gospels themselves, to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And there he met the figure of Jesus. And in reading the Gospels, he discovered the magnetic personality and sublime teachings of Jesus of Nazareth. And what he discovered, of course, was that Jesus' life had been captured in a historically robust set of documents, which even at 2,000 years' distance was still capable of bringing a Gentile like David Suchet to the point of conversion. He was baptized not long after, and the rest, as they say, is history. But obviously in my line of hosting Christians and non-Christians in dialogue for the best part of 17 years on the Unbelievable show, I've met a lot of people who, perhaps a little bit like David Suchet were skeptical of the claims of Scripture, have even questioned whether Jesus is a strictly historical figure. You know, people who say, well, you can't believe the Bible, it's all just fairy tales, isn't it? I'm sure you may have met people who hold a similar attitude. And in fact, the statistics appear to bear that out. Several years ago, there was a piece of research done in the UK. And believe it or not, around 40% of the population, according to this survey, either believe Jesus is a mythical figure or are uncertain if he was a real person. 40%, that's quite remarkable when you think about it. So what I've been trying to do through hosting these discussions, through writing books, through other projects, is to help people to ground the evidence for Christianity. I'm not necessarily holding it out as something they have to believe, but at least pointing out some of the historical evidence that exists, the stuff that, unfortunately, in our culture seems to have got buried underneath a lot of other misinformation, often online, where people have all kinds of crazy theories about, you know, whether or not Jesus existed, when in actual fact, in academic studies, there really is no argument about this. It's a very, very well-established fact, the historicity of Jesus. And in fact, as we'll go on to see, there are lots of reasons to believe that actually we have a very credible set of documents concerning his life, death, and alleged resurrection as well. So I hope some of what I have to say tonight will help you if you encounter someone who's questioning, who's perhaps skeptical, perhaps is, who knows, going on a journey a bit like David Suchet went on. I'm going to bring out four things. There are more that I could mention, but I've restricted it to just four specific areas where I think there's just been an amazing depth and continuing areas of study and research that have sort of opened up in recent decades just how much evidence there is for the reliability of the Gospels and the person of Jesus. The first one I want to touch on, if we go to the next slide, is under the label of genre and manuscript evidence. So, of course, our four main sources for the life of Jesus are the four Gospels. And the first thing that it's worth asking is, what sort of writing are they? That's our first clue to figuring out what we're actually meant to take away from them. And if you go to a gospel like Luke's gospel and just read the introduction, I think that's a really helpful way of finding out, because as we often hear in our Christmas readings, if this bit gets included, this is how Luke's gospel begins. Since many have undertaken to set down an orderly account of the events that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed on to us by those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and servants of the word, I too decided, after investigating everything carefully from the very first, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the truth concerning the things about which you have been instructed. Now, this kind of introduction to a gospel is not how legends and fables and mythologized accounts would have been introduced in that day and age in the ancient world. In fact, all four gospels fall into a category of writing in the ancient world called historical biography. It's the kind of writing that Plutarch and Josephus and other historians of that day and age were doing around the same time for notable figures. So, to those who say, well, these were simply made-up accounts, the first thing you need to say is they don't fit the genre of theological invention, of fable, of mythology. Just as Luke's introduction there to his account of Jesus states, these were written to be understood, at least, as conveying real historical events. Of course, they do also convey theological truth, but those two aren't mutually exclusive. You can have both in one account. But the real question a lot of people have is, well, okay, maybe they were written down to convey historical events. Maybe that is the genre that they exist within. But how do we know that they've reliably done that? There's 2,000 years of history between us and those first writers of these accounts. Have they been distorted beyond repair? And this is the other amazing aspect of New Testament studies. It's just how much of those original Gospels, those original writings, can we recover? Let's start with Jesus himself. New Testament historian N.T. Wright says of Jesus and his crucifixion in particular that it is one of the best attested facts in all of ancient history. So if you do believe in ancient figures of the past like Julius Caesar or Alexander the Great, you shouldn't have any problem believing that Jesus existed. In fact, there are, apart from the Gospels and the New Testament, a number of other extra-biblical sources that reference Jesus and the early Christian movement. You could go to ancient historians like Josephus and Tacitus and Pliny. And those are all important sources. I haven't got time to dig into them tonight. But, of course, our main source of information about Jesus are the Gospels themselves. And when you look at those documents, just in their own right, they are among the most reliable historical documents we have of that time. And here's the helpful key thing to kind of think about it in this way, is that the closer the original texts were written to the events that they describe, then the more reason we have to believe that they're reliable. So if they were written down fairly close to the events, that's a good marker of reliability. And the earlier the existing copies we have are, the more we have of them as well, then the more claim they have to be trustworthy. These are sort of the different markers of reliability that ancient historians use. And so what we can do is to simply line up the Gospels in those respects against other equivalent ancient histories. And what we find is that the New Testament outclasses all other ancient records by a country mile. I've got a sort of easy, well, a kind of graph here or a sort of record here of how the New Testament writings stack up against other equivalent ancient historical writings. And so you can see the original composition dates for the New Testament writings ranging between 49 to 95 AD. And then you're looking at sort of when the earliest manuscripts we have available to us are, and the time that's elapsed effectively between those earliest manuscripts and when they were written down. And you can see that for other ancient writings, you have periods of 400, 1200, 1400 years. For the New Testament writings, it's between 30 to 150 years that we have. And then you've got the number of manuscripts, the number of physical copies we have that date to early times. And again, you're looking at, in many cases, just a handful of documents for some histories of ancient figures. And yet the New Testament has over 25,000. Now, of course, you can dig into this and you can look at the varieties and the types of manuscripts and things you're looking at. But the overall picture is very, very positive for the New Testament. We have histories of Jesus that were written down within the lifetime of his followers in some cases. Certainly, most scholars would certainly put the Gospel of Mark as being within the lifetime of Jesus' followers. And we have manuscripts that go back to very early as well. And then there's this point about the number of them. Why is that significant? Well, it's because the more manuscripts you have, There's this very sort of detective-like process that New Testament scholars can do of textual criticism, looking at the way that these documents were transmitted over time as scribes copied and transmitted copies of the Gospels, and they started to spread out across the Mediterranean world. And because we have so many existing copies to hand, they're able to cross-reference them and cross-check them. And they're able to essentially get back to, with about 99.9% accuracy, the original writings that actually existed. Now, of course, we don't have those originals today. They were written on papyrus. They, crumbled to dust like the vast, vast majority of other historical documents have. And yet, we can say with extraordinary accuracy what the original documents actually said. And that is almost unheard of in any other branch of ancient literature, ancient history. So it is phenomenal when you do look at the actual record that we have an incredibly strong historical record of what was written. So the question is, well, was what was written true? We know that it falls in the genre of a historical biography, so they're reporting, they say they're reporting historical events. These aren't mythological or theological accounts necessarily. We know that there is this manuscript tradition which says that actually we can be very confident we are reading the original words that were written by those in those first documents. And then there's this question, well, could they have made it up? Could it still have been sort of essentially something that was sort of, written down in a hazy way sometime later in another part of the world? Could they have been inventing things? I'd want to give a few more. A lot of people heard of this sort of side of things, the sort of the manuscript tradition and, extra biblical sources. What I've not seen so much of is some of the really interesting, more recent research that's been done on the historicity of Jesus and the way in which the Gospels themselves internally actually bear all kinds of interesting clues to their authenticity and to their credibility. So we're going to go on to the next thing. This is a fascinating area, the names in the Gospels. What's become clear as research has gone on in this area of looking at the Gospels is that the Gospels themselves confirm their own accuracy and reliability when it comes to knowledge of things like geography of the local area, historical events and characters who are mentioned, and details of local customs and culture. In fact, New Testament historian Richard Baucham's book, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, we've got a cover of it on the next slide, was a really groundbreaking piece of scholarship. If you ever want to really dig into this area, it's an excellent place to start. And among many interesting things that he looked into in that book, his research really communicated how the Gospels themselves are filled with evidence that the authors were reporting eyewitness accounts of the very first followers of Christ. These weren't accounts that were like being written down sometime later, generations later, after they'd sort of changed in nature. These were accounts written down because they'd been transmitted by the eyewitness followers. So just one example of this that Baucham's famous for bringing out is the names that were used in the New Testament. So we all know that names change over time. Anyone who has had a child has maybe got a copy of the latest sort of most popular boys and girls names book. And we know that over, in a relatively short space of time, the most popular names at any given time change. I think we were ahead of the curve when 18 years ago we named our oldest child Noah. No one else at the time had a Noah. Now you can't move without bumping into a Noah. But it's just the nature of things that names change. And that was just as true back in the first century. And so think of the names that you do find in the Gospels. Mary, Simon, Andrew, obviously many more. Now, what was interesting is that Richard Bauckham was able to cross-check how frequently names in the Gospels appeared compared to other independent historical records that were available of names that were common in first century Judea. In fact, he used the work of an Israeli scholar called Tal Ilan, who had researched names on burial sites. And what Richard Bauckham found was there was a striking correlation between the names in the Gospels and the names that were the most common, according to the research of Tal Ilan. So the Gospels essentially are full of the same names that were most common during the times and places where Jesus is supposed to have lived. And the point is the Gospels got it right. That is a detail that is very hard to get right unless you are talking to people who lived in that time and place and are telling you about the people who lived in that time and place. If you were to write these stories down, one country over 20 years later, you would not get that detail right. It just wouldn't be possible. A second thing that I think is, or a third thing even, if we go to the next slide, undesigned coincidences. This is another interesting area that, again, not many people are familiar with, but has become an increasing area of research for a number of people. There's a scholar called Dr. Lydia McGrew who has a book called Hidden in Plain View, Undesigned Coincidences in the Gospels and Acts, and I've interviewed Lydia on this. What are undesigned coincidences? Well, undesigned coincidences are details within stories across the different Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John that seem to dovetail with each other, suggesting that the authors knew the truth of the events that they're describing. So that you could describe these coincidences as sort of natural corroborations between separate accounts. They couldn't have been manufactured. It just doesn't make sense that the different Gospel writers were sort of creating scenarios in which one story would map onto another, and yet they do in all kinds of fascinating ways. I'll just give one example that Lydia and others have related. There's the story of the feeding of the 5,000 in John chapter 6. I'm sure many of you are very familiar with it. And I wonder if you can remember which disciple Jesus turns to when he asks where they can go to buy bread for this vast crowd that have followed them into the countryside. It's the disciple Philip. And in the story, of course, Jesus is sort of setting a bit of a test for his disciples, and he receives the answer he's probably fully expecting from a bewildered Philip saying, 6 months' wages couldn't feed all of these people who are here. And that, of course, sets the stage for one of Jesus' most memorable miracles, the feeding of the 5,000, the bread and the fish. Now, the question is, many people would say, well, was this story just invented? Was this just a sort of nice story that, the writer of John just put in there as a way of kind of showing Jesus' divinity? But the fact is that there is a curious detail in this story, which is why did Jesus ask Philip in particular? Because if you're inventing a story like this, it would have made more sense to ask the chief disciple, Peter, someone like that. Why Philip? And it looks like the answer might lie in other parts of the Gospels, because we've learned earlier on in John that Philip is from the town of Bethsaida. Now, as it happens, when this story is also recorded elsewhere in Luke chapter 9, we're also told something that we don't find out in John's Gospel, where the miracle happens. It's near the town of Bethsaida. So, furnished with that additional information, you can suddenly make sense of why Jesus is asking Philip in particular about, local outlets for getting food. It's because of all the disciples, he would be the most likely to know the answer to that question, however, rhetorical it was on Jesus' part. You see, Luke's account makes sense of John's account, and in the process, both of the accounts sort of are corroborating each other. Now, that's just one small example. There are literally hundreds more that are explored in works like Lydia's book. And admittedly, one single example isn't going to, necessarily convince a skeptic of the general trustworthiness of the Gospels. But when you bring them all together, there is a sort of cumulative weight as you see the corroboration of these undesigned coincidences across the Gospels and indeed into Acts and parts of Paul's letters. There's lots of things where a statement here makes sense of an event over there. And it's a bit like the pieces of a puzzle falling into place, these interlocking connections between multiple details in the Gospels. They can't be just explained away by scribal ingenuity or later invention. As Lydia says, these undesigned coincidences give these stories the ring of truth. There's these interlocking aspects to them. So that's another really interesting area that's been increasingly, an area of research in recent years. I'll give one more. Places and archaeology. In fact, there's an excellent book called Can We Trust the Gospels by Peter J. Williams. I'll bring it up on the slide here. If you want a really short but very packed full of information book relating some of the things I'm talking about this evening, but many more as well. Peter J. Williams is a Bible scholar in Cambridge, and this book is a wonderful way of digging in a bit deeper to some of these aspects of the reliability of the Gospels. And in it, Peter Williams, drawing on research by people like others, Lydia and Richard Borkham, he details all kinds of manner of ways in which the Gospel writers show that they're clearly familiar with things like the times and places and customs of Jesus' day. I mean, when it comes to geography, it's little things, like when Jesus tells the parable of the Good Samaritan, and he tells of the man going down from Jerusalem to Jericho. Now, again, you have to be a local to know that Jerusalem is on a hill, and the road that leads to Jericho does indeed go down from Jerusalem, and also that it was obviously a place that was known for being dangerous for thieves and so on, and robbers. And that's a fairly trivial example, but time and again, the gospel writers put the events surrounding Jesus in the right place and the right historical context. You know, Luke especially gives a huge number of details about rulers and locations and historical context that all actually add up, that are actually really useful for knowing about the history of that time and place. They get these details right. They know where the towns are. They know where the lakes are. They know the geography, the different ways that objects and places are referred to locally. Now, what you have to remember is that this wasn't the kind of information in that day and age that you could Google, as we might be able to now. There weren't even any reference books in libraries. It simply wasn't possible to get this stuff right if you were writing in a different place at a different time. You had to be a local. You had to know this stuff to be able to get it right. And they do get it right time and time again. I mean, if you do compare, for instance, the details you get in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John to later accounts of Jesus, sometimes they're called apocryphal Gospels or Gnostic Gospels, you immediately see the difference, because in those much later sort of accounts or supposed accounts of Jesus' life, you get very little detail of local custom or geography or names. It's much more vague, much less connected to real history and time and place. Whereas if you do go to Israel today and actually look for some of the places that are mentioned in the Gospels, you'll find them being uncovered all the time. It's fascinating, actually, to see the way in which the Gospels are being corroborated sort of year on year by all kinds of amazing geographical and historical and archaeological discoveries. There's a picture of one, a fairly recent discovery. So John chapter 9, there's the story of Jesus healing a blind man, and he tells him to wash in the pool of Siloam in Jerusalem. But the location of this pool up until recently had never been discovered. In fact, many people therefore assumed it was, again, one of these sort of invented stories, essentially, because, well, we've never found this pool of Siloam. Was it just something that was invented for this particular purpose? But then in 2004, during construction work, the steps of the pool were actually unearthed, and eventually the whole site excavated, revealing this grand pool that makes exact sense of Jesus' story. And again, that's just one of many, many archaeological finds that confirm the biblical accounts. So these are just sort of 3 or 4 historical clues as to the fact that we've got good reason to trust that these accounts are historical and they are reliable. As I say, we've got the quality of the manuscripts, we've got things like the names in the Gospels, we've got things like these undesigned coincidences that cross-corroborate the different stories, the places, the archaeology, the historical accuracy generally of the Gospels. So this has been a really quick whistle-stop tour of some of the lines of evidence that you could reach for when looking at why it does make sense to take these documents seriously, to take the life of Jesus as a historical fact, at the very least, but also that we can really have a lot of confidence in the stories and the people who were relating those stories to us, and that they've come to us in a more or less consistent and reliable way in the Bibles we have in our hands. Now, of course, all of this is sort of leading up to the big question, could it be that a miracle like the resurrection could be true as well? And there's a whole other kind of talk and set of arguments that I want to bring to bear in thinking about that. But at the very least, I think when we're speaking to people who are skeptical, they have to accept that the weight of history certainly is in favour of the reliability of these documents. You have to take them seriously. You can't just dismiss Jesus as fairy tales. Now, in the end, I could stand here all night giving you evidence that you can trust these accounts. I suppose the real question is, what difference does it make in the end? And I don't want you to go away just impressed that there's a strong historical record here, because it's not really the words on the page that are really the important thing in the end. It's the person who stands behind them, Jesus Christ. So when David Suchet had his encounter with the Bible, it wasn't the literary brilliance of the historical pedigree of the text that changed his life. It was actually meeting the person behind those words, Jesus Christ. And C.S. Lewis had a famous saying. I've got a little bit of it that can go up on the screen, but I'm going to give you the full saying here. He said this in his book, Mere Christianity. He said, "I'm trying here to prevent anyone saying the really foolish thing that people often say about him. I'm ready to accept Jesus as a great moral teacher, but I don't accept his claim to be God. That is the one thing we must not say. A man who was merely a man and said the sorts of things Jesus said would not be a great moral teacher. He would either be a lunatic on the level with the man who says he's a poached egg, or else he would be the devil of hell. You must make your choice. Either this man was and is the Son of God, or else a madman, or something worse. You can shut him up for a fool, you can spit at him and kill him as a demon, or you can fall at his feet and call him Lord and God. But let us not come with any patronizing nonsense about his being a great human teacher. He has not left that open to us. He did not intend to." I've always found this a really helpful way of thinking about it, because I think lots of people would like Jesus to remain a purely historical figure in the pages of the book, maybe a good moral teacher, a person of historical interest, because if held at arm's length in that way, Jesus doesn't present too much of a threat or an interruption to our daily lives. But as Lewis said, Jesus himself hasn't left us that option in the things he actually said about himself, because he's the one who describes himself both as the Son of Man and as the Son of God, the one who claimed to be able to forgive sins, who was a friend of outcasts and untouchables, whose extraordinary words and actions led to his trial and crucifixion, and who rose again in vindication of his claim to be Lord and God. If you like, this is the living word that steps out of the written word of the Gospels and says to us and those around us, just as he said to his first followers, "Who do you say I am?" And I think for many people that is a real challenge. They want a Jesus of history, not necessarily a living Jesus of today. But I think our response as those first disciples should be, "My Lord and my God." And so if you are a Christian, then you're here to do what those first Christians did, to proclaim a very real Jesus who lived, who died, and who we believe was resurrected as well, and to tell this story of the kingdom that he talked about to our friends and neighbours. And that despite everything that we see around us, this God has not stayed far off and uninterested, but he has come close. He's entered our world, and he's lived with us, died a shameful criminal's death on our behalf, and now invites us all into this new life, where we can trust our lives to him and live and move and have our very being in him. And I believe that idea, that reality has transformed the world. So that means we can look at the historical evidence for Jesus. But even if you never got around to telling someone about this interesting historical evidence for Jesus, why that makes sense to take the story of Jesus seriously, it's part of a much bigger, more important story in a way, that there is a God who came to be with us, to be part of our lives so that we could be part of his life. And I think perhaps the place to start, though, often with people is to say, this isn't just pie in the sky, interesting fairy story stuff. It started with a real person in a real place who changed the lives of the people around him, and the movement that he began changed the world around it as well. And that movement's still going on today. And I'm so glad that we have, though, as we perhaps profess that in our lives and try to share it with others, a real historical tie back to those first followers, the first eyewitnesses, and to Jesus himself, in a set of documents that really do connect us with those who have gone before us. I was on this new podcast that I've been doing with Matt's help called Re-Enchanting. Our most recent guest on the podcast is Tom Holland, who's quite a well-known historian, writer of popular books, and I don't know if you've listened to his popular podcast, The Rest is History. But he's been on a really interesting journey himself, and he talks about this in one of his larger books, Dominion, which is the story of how the Christian Revolution really has shaped the whole of the West. And towards the end of the podcast, I was asking him about his own journey in this respect, not just as an academic and a historian looking at the way that Christianity has changed the world, but at a personal level, what that's meant to him. And he has said, you know, he still sort of has a sort of, he's a kind of agnostic who really wants to believe, I would say. And he does frequently go to church. And he loves being in church. There's something about the story, the greatest story ever told, that really speaks to him as a person, not just as a historian. And he said to me, it's when I'm most connected with that story historically that it means the most to me, when I'm sitting somewhere where it feels like I'm part of this story that goes back 2,000 years and more. And that has led to him really going on a journey that is not just an academic one and an intellectual one, but a personal, spiritual journey, finding out whether this historical figure who changed the world 2,000 years ago could also be a figure today who continues to transform lives. And I think that's an amazing privilege that we get to have this extraordinary story that goes back to a historical figure who changed the world, but one who is still bringing actors and historians and many other people to faith in him as well. So thank you very much for listening this evening, and I'd be delighted to take any questions you may have. So thank you. This is the awkward moment where we wait for some hands, but I'll just while you're thinking of a question, if you have any, I will reiterate there are some of the first book available at the back if you're one of the very few people who haven't picked up a copy when I've been here before, but I'd be delighted to sign one or two of those as well before the evening's out. But yes, I will do my best if there are any questions that are of interest. I don't claim to be an expert, by the way, on biblical history, but I have a layman's understanding of some of the issues, and I'll do my best to answer them.
There are a number of books which are not in the Bible in Old Testament times and New Testament times. Has anybody looked at those and sort of done, you know, when you say you're doing the cross-referencing, which makes these things appear true?
Which books are you thinking of, as in apocryphal books that don't always appear in? Yes. Yes, so I sort of referenced some of those, you know, the apocryphal and Gnostic Gospels. These were essentially later sort of accounts of Jesus' life of some sort or another. So, you know, there's the Gospel of Judas and the Gospel of Mary. There aren't really any that were written in anything like the time frame of the four Gospels that we do have in the Bible. So I think you're looking really at mainly 2nd century is when those Gospels were being, certainly as far as we can tell, they were being written down. And as I say, they tended to be being written down sometime after and in sort of further locations from where the events took. And when you read them, as I say, they don't have this sort of historical sort of feel to them. They feel a lot more like mythological sort of stories, accretions, really. And I think, the reason why we do have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John in our Bibles is because historically, the early councils that decided what was going to be in and out of the canon, they knew what had the best historical pedigree, and so it was at those points that those sort of Gospels. So there's another one called, I think it's the Gospel of Hermes, the shepherd, which was actually, that was floating around probably at the end of the 1st century, but it never made it into the canon. And I think the reason for that is simply that it didn't have the same historical pedigree as the Gospels that we're very familiar with,
I was astonished by the figure you gave at the beginning, 40% of people either thought Jesus was a mythological figure
or weren't sure if he existed, yeah.
Has that changed over time? What you put it down?
Yeah, I was surprised at how how big that number was when I first came across it. The research was done by a very sort of reliable agency at the time. This was going back to, I think, 2015 that research was done. Interestingly, they've just done another similar set of research. It was called the Talking Jesus Report. And I do have a copy of it, but I can't remember off the top of my head with the same similar questions whether that had changed significantly. But if I remember rightly, it was not that far off it. It was still. And I think, in some ways I was surprised because, as we know, the weight of historical evidence is so against that in terms of, you will not find really anyone in academic studies who takes that view. But the problem is we live in a culture which is flooded now with a certain very skeptical view of Christianity. And when you've got people with large platforms like Richard Dawkins, who have historically, promoted a lot of this sort of Jesus mythicism stuff, sadly that does tend to take root in people's, and just the popular imagination, I think, unfortunately, perhaps the church hasn't done a great job of really showing people why this stuff has a historical pedigree. There just seems to be a kind of an assumption that Jesus is a bit like, I don't know, King Arthur or Robin Hood or something like that, a sort of semi-mythical figure, maybe with some slight purchase on reality, but it simply is a very different kind of person you're talking about when it comes to Jesus. Yes.
As a member of the older generation, this question might surprise you. Would you like to explain what a podcast is?
So a podcast is simply some kind of audio show that you can listen to on a device like a mobile phone or a laptop and listen to at any time of day or night at your own convenience. So rather than having to be at the radio when In Our Time is on, you can simply listen to it at any time you choose by downloading it to your phone. Sorry? You need the link. I mean, my phone comes with a podcast app which has pretty much all the podcasts you could ever want on it. So you just go to the app, and if you wanted to search, My Unbelievable Show, as was, just type in Unbelievable. If you want the Re-Enchanting podcast, you just type in. Oh, yes, that's the way most people listen these days. It's just through their particular, app that they have on their phone. And so I tend to be listening in the car, when I'm on a run, something like that. It's very convenient.
Mike listens to the wireless, and his television's still black and white.
Right. Well, we were just talking at our table earlier about the way things are changing in media and whether, very few people, I think, below a certain age these days very often watch live TV. It's all changed remarkably with the advent of the internet.
You've explained how the Gospels corroborate one another. What would you say to somebody who said, but what about those areas where the Gospels don't match?
Where there appear to be contradictions. Yes, and this obviously have come up many times in debates and so on. And the thing I'd say to that is that's completely reasonable and a reasonable expectation that will happen on a historical basis, because you see that happening all the time in other historical documents where we've got different accounts of the same war or something. You will find, one account says this, another says this. The fact that there are differences in the way that these accounts are told in no way suggests that this thing didn't happen. It's just that you've got different perspectives on the same account. Any police detective will tell you when they interview people who witnessed some event or crime, they will get quite different accounts, but they're all because people are watching them from different perspectives and so on. And it's very often when you put them together that you can understand why this person saw it this way and that person saw it that way. I think a lot of that's going on with the Gospels a lot of the time. A lot of it, though, I think, and again, there's a great book by a Bible scholar called Mike Licona called Why Are There Differences Between the Gospels? And he's done a lot of work looking at similar biographies of that day and age by biographers like Plutarch and Josephus, and the way that they told the stories of the people that they told, and the way in which the gospel writers, in very similar ways, are doing some of the things that they do frequently, like spotlighting certain characters, for instance, so that you might, in one account of the resurrection narratives, get only one or two women who are mentioned, and in another one you get 3 or 4 women who are mentioned, or you get... And the point is that this was a common technique of that time to sort of spotlight one character over another. It didn't mean there weren't other characters there, it just meant the authors only decided. So when you kind of start to understand some of the literary conventions and the fact that they were also happy to sometimes move events around, so you don't always see things chronologically as you might expect from modern reportage standards, but the gospel writers were happy to move this event that you might find here in Luke to earlier on in John or whatever it is. What you find is that there were just different literary conventions that existed back then that didn't make them less reliable. It was simply that was the way they wrote biographies then, and we have different conventions today for how we might write biographies. But even when you read a biography of someone, you are not getting a blow-by-blow account of everything. The author is very specifically taking this moment and that moment, or creating a theme in a chapter or something, and you're getting very similar things in the Gospels. And when those get presented as contradictions, I think that's a very wooden way of looking at it. You simply have to understand the way that these tended to sort of abide by the conventions of their time. And most of those supposed contradictions tend to evaporate when you actually simply read them in their context in that kind of way. Well, that's probably
Is that it then?
a good place to stop.
Well, Justin, thank you.
Thank
Is this on? Is this on?
There we go.
Yeah, it is on. Thank you very much, Justin. It's been an absolute joy to have you. I think you come every year that we've run a curry night. So it's lovely to have you, lovely to receive from you. And we've been really blessed by the Brierley family because we had Lucy to talk to our girls group about a couple of months ago.
Yeah, it was, I think.
To which men were invited. So perhaps some of you came, and she much blessed us as well. So thank you very much. And can we just pray for you before?
Yes, please, thank you.
Heavenly Father, we just thank you for Justin's ministry in Premier Christian Radio, for his shows that have meant so much to us. And we just ask for your blessing and guidance on his future, that you will guide him along the right paths so that he may proclaim your gospel in all that he does. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
And before you run away... a very small thank you for
Thank you very much.
all that you've done.
Thank you very much.
And
Thank you very
enjoy
much
it.
indeed.
Yeah, no, thanks.
Thank you, everyone.